What would you do if a princess from another world tried to slap you in front of an entire galactic council, only to scream in agony as her own hand shattered against your cheek? The sound still echoes in my memory, that wet, cracking noise, followed by silence so thick you could taste it. And I remember thinking in that frozen moment that this was either going to start a war or something far more complicated. And honestly, I wasn't sure which outcome terrified me more. My name is Marcus Cole, and 6 months ago I was just a xenolinguistic specialist attached to humanity's first diplomatic envoy to the Vel'Korin Empire, a civilization that had watched Earth from afar for 3 centuries, studying us like scientists observe bacteria in a petri dish. And when they finally decided we were worth talking to, they made it abundantly clear that they considered themselves our superiors in every conceivable way. The Vel'Korians were beautiful in the way that expensive art is beautiful, elegant and refined, and absolutely certain of their own value, with skin that held a subtle luminescent glow and ears that swept to delicate points like living sculptures. And their princess, Lyra Vel'Korin, was considered the jewel of their entire civilization. A prodigy of diplomacy who had brokered 17 interstellar treaties before her 100th cycle, which translated roughly to 20 for Earth years. I first saw her during the opening ceremonies on the Vel'Korian homeworld, a planet so perfectly manicured it looked fake, with silver forests and crystalline lakes that reflected 3 moons. And she walked into the grand atrium wearing a fitted tactical-style uniform in deep midnight blue that somehow managed to look both militaristic and elegant, her platinum hair flowing past her shoulders like liquid starlight. And I made the mistake of catching her gaze across the crowded chamber. Her eyes were a striking violet, sharp and intelligent, and filled with barely concealed contempt as they swept over our delegation. And I felt myself being evaluated and dismissed in the span of a single heartbeat, catalogued as just another primitive from the species that still solved problems with violence and hadn't even achieved faster than light travel on their own. I should have been offended, but honestly, I was too busy being fascinated. Because beneath that mask of aristocratic disdain, I saw something else flickering in her expression, something that looked almost like curiosity. And I filed that observation away for later as our ambassador stepped forward to begin the formal introductions. The first 3 days of negotiations were an exercise in barely concealed hostility, with the Vel'Korian delegation treating every human suggestion like a particularly amusing joke told by a child who didn't understand the punchline. And Princess Lyra was the worst of them all, interrupting our proposals with cutting remarks and dismissive gestures that made the translator drones work overtime to soften her words. "Your species has potential," she said during the second day's session, and the way she emphasized the word potential made it sound like an insult. But potential without guidance is merely chaos waiting to happen. And the galactic community has enough chaos already without adding humanity's particular brand of enthusiasm to the mixture. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted copper. Because my job was to translate and advise, not to start interstellar incidents. But Ambassador Chen caught my eye and gave me a small nod that said she understood exactly how I was feeling. And that silent solidarity was the only thing that kept me from saying something I would regret. The breaking point came on the 4th day, during a cultural exchange ceremony that was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill. And I still don't know if what happened was a calculated insult or just spectacular cultural ignorance on both sides. The Vel'Korians had prepared a demonstration of their mental abilities, a form of psychic projection that allowed them to share memories and emotions directly. And when Princess Lyra stepped forward to demonstrate on me, I should have said no. Should have remembered the briefings about how Vel'Korian psychic contact was considered deeply intimate in their culture. But I was so focused on being a good diplomat that I just nodded and let her place her fingertips against my temples. I felt her consciousness brush against mine, cool and sharp like a blade made of winter wind. And she began sifting through my surface thoughts with all the delicacy of someone sorting through garbage. And then she found something that made her recoil in shock and disgust. Though I never learned exactly what memory or thought had offended her so deeply. "You dare," she hissed, her violet eyes blazing with fury. "You dare harbor such thoughts about a princess of the Vel'Korin bloodline?" And I opened my mouth to apologize for whatever accidental offense I had committed, but before I could form words, she pulled back her hand and slapped me across the face with all the strength her slender frame could muster. And what happened next changed everything. The impact was supposed to be devastating, a blow that would have knocked any Vel'Korin unconscious and possibly fractured their orbital bone. Because the Vel'Korin line was genetically enhanced for physical superiority, and Lyra had been trained in combat since she could walk. But instead of my head snapping to the side, instead of me crumpling to the ground in agony, I just stood there feeling a mild sting on my cheek while a horrifying cracking sound filled the chamber and Princess Lyra screamed. Time seemed to stop as she staggered backward, clutching her right hand to her chest. And I could see it even from where I stood, the unnatural angle of her fingers. The way her delicate bones had crumpled against my human cheekbone like paper against stone. And the chamber erupted into chaos as Vel'Korin guards rushed forward with weapons drawn, and our security team formed a protective wall around Ambassador Chen. "Stand down," I shouted in Vel'Korin, raising my hands to show I meant no harm. I didn't do anything, I just stood there. She struck me. But no one was listening, because Princess Lyra was sobbing now, her face pale with shock and pain, and the accusation in every Vel'Korin I was clear enough to read without any psychic abilities. They took me into custody, of course, though custody for the Vel'Korians meant a sterile white room with no furniture and a force field across the door, rather than anything as barbaric as physical restraints. And I spent 8 hours alone with nothing but my thoughts and the growing certainty that I had somehow destroyed humanity's first attempt at joining the galactic community. The door finally opened to reveal Ambassador Chen, looking tired but not defeated, and behind her was a Vel'Korin physician, whose expression mixed clinical curiosity with barely suppressed alarm. "They've figured it out," Chen said, sitting down across from me on the floor. Since there were no chairs, their medical scans finally explained what happened. "And Marcus, you're not going to believe this, but apparently humans are the galaxy's version of a bulletproof vest." She explained it in terms I could understand. How the Vel'Korians and most other spacefaring species had evolved on low-gravity worlds with gentle climates and minimal predators, developing intelligence and technology as their primary survival strategies while their physical forms remained relatively fragile. Like porcelain figurines that had learned to build starships, Earth, by contrast, was what the Vel'Korians called a deathworld, a high-gravity nightmare filled with apex predators and extreme weather and geological instability. And humans had evolved to survive all of it, developing bones dense enough to shatter Vel'Korin metacarpals on impact and muscle fibers strong enough to crush most alien species in a casual handshake. "Princess Lyra's hand has 17 fractures," the physician said, his voice carrying a note of scientific wonder that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. "And our analysis indicates that your cheekbone didn't even bruise from the impact, which should be impossible based on everything we understood about humanoid physiology." I sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over in my mind like a strange artifact. And I found myself thinking not about the diplomatic implications or the potential for military advantage, but about Lyra's face in that moment of impact. The way her contempt had transformed into confusion and then into genuine fear. "I need to see her," I said, surprising myself with the words. "I need to apologize." Ambassador Chen raised an eyebrow. In that way she had that said she was evaluating my sanity. "You want to apologize to the woman who assaulted you in front of a room full of diplomats? The same woman who's been treating our entire species like particularly disappointing pets for the past 4 days. I nodded, because something had shifted in my understanding during those 8 hours alone. Some recognition that Lyra's cruelty hadn't been personal but cultural. That she had been raised in a civilization that genuinely believed humans were inferior beings. And that having her own body prove that belief catastrophically wrong must have shattered more than just her hand. It took 2 days of negotiation, but they finally let me visit her in the medical wing. And I found her in a private chamber, filled with soft light and flowering plants. Her hand encased in a regeneration matrix that hummed with alien technology, and when she saw me enter, something complicated happened in her violet eyes that I couldn't quite read. "They told me you requested this meeting," she said. Her voice, raw and stripped of its usual aristocratic polish, I assumed it was to gloat, to remind me of my humiliation in front of someone who would carry the story. "Back to your primitive world." I pulled up a chair without asking permission, and sat down close enough that she could have reached out and touched me with her uninjured hand, a deliberate gesture of trust that I hoped she would recognize. "I came to apologize," I said, and watched confusion ripple across her features. "I should have warned you." Should have explained that human physiology might be different from what your records indicated. And I'm sorry that my failure to speak up caused you pain. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process this information, trying to fit it into her worldview where humans were primitive and arrogant and certainly wouldn't apologize to someone who had struck them. And finally she laughed, a broken sound that was half amusement and half despair. You apologize, she repeated, shaking her head. You apologize for my assault on your person because you didn't warn me that hitting you would hurt me. And you wonder why the galactic community doesn't know what to make of your species. I shrugged, because she had a point. We're complicated. Humans, I mean. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us in creative new ways, every generation. So we learned to be tough and to adapt and to find unexpected solutions to problems. But we also learned that fighting everything that scared us was a good way to go extinct. So we figured out diplomacy and cooperation and forgiveness. She looked down at her injured hand, flexing the visible fingers slightly beneath the regeneration matrix. In Vel'Korin culture, what I did would demand retribution. A strike to the face is a challenge of honor, and the struck party has the right to respond with triple force. You could have claimed any punishment you wished, up to and including exile or death, but I don't want to punish you, I said. And I meant it, because looking at her now, seeing the vulnerability beneath the aristocratic mask, I understood that she was just as much a product of her upbringing as I was of mine. I want to understand you. I want to know why you looked at me across that chamber on the first day with something that wasn't quite contempt. And I want to know what thought you found in my mind that offended you so deeply. She was quiet for a long time, and I watched emotions play across her face like clouds across a troubled sky. And finally she sighed and met my eyes with something that looked almost like respect. You were thinking that I seemed lonely, she said softly. You looked at me surrounded by my delegation and my guards and my status. And you thought that I seemed desperately, achingly lonely. And you wondered what it would be like to know someone so isolated that an entire room full of admirers couldn't fill the emptiness in their eyes. I remembered now. That fleeting thought that had passed through my mind during the opening ceremonies. And I felt my face heat with embarrassment, because she was right. I had thought exactly that. And I hadn't even realized how clearly it had registered in my consciousness. I'm sorry, I started to say, but she held up her uninjured hand to stop me. Don't apologize for seeing me, she said, and there was wonder in her voice now, the same wonder that had been in the physician's voice, but somehow warmer, more personal. No one sees me, Marcus Cole. They see the princess, the diplomat, the jewel of the Vel'Korin bloodline, but no one sees Lyra. And you looked at me for perhaps 3 seconds on the first day, and you saw more of who I truly am than people who have known me for decades. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, just sat with her in the soft light while the regeneration matrix hummed its healing song. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted between us. Some wall crumbling that had been built from assumptions and cultural programming and fear. Over the next 2 weeks, as her hand healed and the diplomatic negotiations continued with considerably more mutual respect on both sides, Lyra and I developed an unexpected friendship that scandalized both of our delegations for entirely different reasons. She taught me about Vel'Korin history and culture, about the psychic bonds that connected members of noble houses and the loneliness of being the only telepath in a room full of mental silence. And I taught her about Earth, about our wars and our art, and our stubborn refusal to let our planet's hostility break our spirits. Humans are impossible, she told me one evening as we walked through the silver forest near the diplomatic compound, her healed hand occasionally brushing against mine in a way that felt intentional. You should have been destroyed 1,000 times over by your own world, and yet here you are, reaching for the stars with the same hands that once threw rocks at predators in the darkness. I laughed, because it was true. We're too stubborn to die. It's our best quality and our worst one, depending on who you ask. She stopped walking and turned to face me, her violet eyes catching the light of the 3 moons overhead. And I realized suddenly that I was going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. This instant of connection between 2 impossible people from 2 impossible worlds. What I accessed in your mind, she said quietly. The thought about my loneliness. There was more, wasn't there? Something you deliberately didn't think to loudly because you knew it would be inappropriate. My heart was pounding now. Because she was right. There had been more. A fleeting wish that I could be the one to understand her. to reach past the barriers she had built and find the person hiding behind them. And I had suppressed it instantly because I was a junior diplomat and she was royalty. And the galaxy didn't work that way. You don't have to answer, she continued, when I remained silent. I already know because I felt the edges of it before I pulled away. And I have spent every night since then wondering what it would mean if I felt the same way about someone my people consider barely more evolved than livestock. Lyra, I said. And her name felt like a prayer on my tongue. Your people tried to kill me for standing still while you hurt yourself hitting me. If they found out that we were even having this conversation, I don't want to think about what they would do. She smiled. Then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look young and vulnerable and heartbreakingly beautiful. Let them try, she said, and there was steel in her voice beneath the warmth. Let them try to take away the first person who has ever made me feel less alone. And they will discover that the princess of the Vel'Korin bloodline has claws of her own. She reached out and took my hand, her healed fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt the cool touch of her psychic presence brushing against my mind. Not invasive this time, but gentle, questioning, asking permission rather than demanding entry. I opened myself to her, let her feel what I had been hiding. The growing affection and respect and wonder that had built over 2 weeks of conversations and shared silences. And through our connection, I felt her own emotions echoing back at me. The same wonder and the same terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than either of our species had ever imagined. The treaty was signed 3 days later, and it was different from what either side had originally proposed. A partnership of equals rather than a protectorate arrangement, with provisions for cultural exchange and mutual defense, and a shared research initiative to study the strange phenomenon of human durability. But more important than the treaty, at least to me, was the moment when Princess Lyra Vel'Korin stood before the assembled Galactic Council and made a statement that would be remembered for generations. We came to this negotiation believing humans were primitive, she said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber. We believed we were offering charity to a lesser species, guidance to children who did not know better, and we were wrong. Humanity is not lesser, merely different, forged in the crucible of a world that would have destroyed any other species. And they emerged from that forge not broken, but tempered, not defeated, but defiant. They are not our inferiors to be guided. They are our equals, to be respected. And if the Vel'Korin Empire can learn this lesson, she paused. And I could have sworn she glanced at me in the crowd. Then perhaps there is hope for the galaxy yet. The applause that followed was tentative at first. Confused, because no Vel'Korin princess had ever publicly acknowledged another species as equals. But it grew stronger as the implications sank in, and by the time it faded, something fundamental had changed in the way the galaxy viewed humanity. I found her after the ceremony, waiting in a small garden filled with crystalline flowers that sang in the wind. And she was smiling that real smile again. The one that made her look like she had discovered a secret that the universe had been keeping from her. You're leaving tomorrow, she said. Not a question. Returning to Earth with your delegation. I nodded, because it was true. Because duty called, and the galaxy was vast, and we were both still bound by the expectations of our peoples. But she stepped closer and took my hand again, and I felt her psychic presence wrap around my consciousness like a familiar embrace. The treaty includes provisions for a permanent diplomatic exchange, she said, her violet eyes sparkling with mischief, and I have volunteered to be Vel'Koria's first ambassador to Earth. If, she added, suddenly uncertain, if you would want that, I answered her with a kiss, gentle and brief and appropriate for a garden where anyone might see. And through our psychic connection, I felt her joy resonating with my own. Two lonely people who had found each other across the impossible gulf of stars and species and expectations. I would want that, I said, when we finally pulled apart. I would want that very much. She laughed, and the sound was like music, like starlight made audible. Good, because I have to warn you, Marcus Cole, humans may be physically indestructible, but Vel'Korin courtship traditions are extremely thorough, and I intend to follow every single one of them. I didn't know what Vel'Korin courtship traditions entailed, but looking at her smile, feeling her hand in mine, and her presence warm in my thoughts, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Two impossible people from two impossible worlds, proving that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. And if her people or mine objected, well, they would discover that a human who had survived a death world and a princess who had learned to bear her claws made a formidable team. And some connections were simply too strong to be broken by prejudice or tradition or fear. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. And honestly, neither did we. But for the first time in my life, standing in that garden with starlight in her hair and hope in her eyes, I couldn't wait to find out.